So welcome everybody. We had a break there. We haven't been together for 2 weeks, so it's great to be back. For those of you who celebrated Passover, I hope you had a great time. For those of you who celebrated Easter, I hope you had a great time. And we're back to normal now.
So and I've got my husband back. I've got my husband back. I've got my husband from hospital after 7 weeks. So came back yesterday. Goodness. So that's lovely.
That is amazing. Well, I'm glad you shared that. Wonderful. Thank you.
Hello, glad to be here.
Oh, it's good to see you, Len. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, so this week's Torah portion is Shmini, and it's actually we're going to be discussing, there's one story, one very disturbing story, as you know, what the last two teachings we did in Leviticus, it's a lot of things having to do with sacrifices and purity, and we discussed some of that stuff. And after this week, we're going back to more of that stuff. But there is one story, okay? It's a very disturbing story. It's a troubling story, but it's what we are going to be discussing today. And it's the story that's at the beginning of chapter 10, okay? And of course, it's the story of Nadav and Avihu. These are two sons of Aaron. Aaron has 4 sons, and these two sons are do something very troubling, or at least, and what we want to do is figure out exactly what it is they did. What was the problem? So I'll just read you. It's a total of three verses that tell the story. Now, Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before the Lord a strange fire, which he had not commanded them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them, and they died at the instance of the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when he said, through those nearest to me, I will be sanctified and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. So it's a very dramatic, very tragic story. And the first thing that I want to understand is, what did they do wrong? Now, Scripture tells us 2 things, essentially, that help us understand this. One is that they brought a strange fire. And the other is that this strange fire was something that they were not commanded to do by God. So on the one hand, it's kind of simple. At the very least, there's a very definite statement here that they did something they were not commanded to do. Now, there's a difference between doing something you're not commanded to do and violating a commandment, okay? It doesn't say they violated a commandment. It says they did something they were not commanded to do. In other words, it seems from the context here that what they did was something additional. They did something on their own initiative that they were not commanded to do. And very often, if you do something on your own initiative, if you are, you have the right intentions, you're doing something good, you're doing something that doesn't harm anybody, it's not going to be a problem, okay? So, let me give an example. Okay, so if there's a commandment to give charity to the poor, okay? As a commandment to give certain measures of charity to the poor. If you give additional charity to the poor, it's not going to be a problem. If anything, it'll be a blessing. So here, it's not that they, at least from the context and from the words of Scripture, it doesn't seem like they did something wrong. They violated a commandment, but they did something extra that God had not commanded them to do. So what is the problem? The other question I ask here is, when we have these 2 parts of the verse, we have a strange fire, that was not commanded. The words "that was not commanded" is that used to define what it is we mean by a strange fire. In other words, is a strange fire anything that is not commanded? Or was there something specific about this fire that made it strange or foreign? Okay. So as in so many of these types of discussions that we have in scripture, when we hit something that really is difficult and troubling, we never have one answer. Okay. There are a number of commentaries and they give a number of different approaches here. So Rashi, which we quote very often, he is probably the most classic commentator from the Middle Ages. He here gives two possibilities. He actually quotes a discussion in the Talmud between two great rabbis dating back probably to the 3rd or 4th century. And they have a discussion and they have a disagreement, okay? One says that what these two people did wrong was they taught something. They went and taught a rule or a teaching to the nation of Israel in front of Moses, in some way being disrespectful for Moses. It's a picture yourself, your pastor or your rabbi is in the middle of teaching something to the congregation, and you get up in the middle of service and you start teaching everybody, okay? It's not nice. You know, you're interrupting, and also you're making it as if you're the expert and you're standing before the big expert, okay? It's a little strange though, okay, because this interpretation has nothing to do with fire, has nothing to do with any kind of action that they would have done. So it may be this was part of the problem, but it's hard to understand how this solves what we're saying. A second approach he brings also does not technically explain what the strange fire is, but it does give us an interesting background. That was that they were drunk. They were drunk. And how do they justify this interpretation? Because right after this whole situation with after the death of Nadav and Avihu, and then God commands them, Moses commands them how to remove the dead bodies from the temple. Right after that, in verse 8, God speaks to Aaron and tells him, no one should ever enter the temple drunk. So they take that context to say, why all of a sudden is God commanding Aaron not to be drunk? It must be that there was a drinking problem here. And so based on that context, they say this was the problem with Nadav and Avihu. Now, I think, I'm not sure whether they were drunk or not. I can't begin to tell you that, but I think this begins to lay a foundation for a different approach, okay? Another commentary, Ibn Ezra, is a commentary that was originally from Spain, 15th century. And first of all, he's a commentary that actually tries to define what does scripture mean when it says a strange fire. And he said the problem was that they lit their own fire. They have the pan where they're supposed to hold the incense, and they took a match or whatever, and they lit the fire on the incense. And that was not what was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be God's fire. Now, what is he talking about? Go back and look at the last verse of chapter 9, right before this story. Here we are in the middle. Don't forget, just to remind you where we are. We're in the middle of the dedication of the temple. Everybody has gathered. It is after the 7 days of preparation when Aaron and his sons are holed up in the tabernacle, learning how to bring the sacrifices, figuring out what to do. And it's on the 8th day when they have, in front of the entire nation, they have this dedication of the altar. Everyone, they bring the first sacrifices, and Aaron and his sons come out and bless the nation. And verse 24, the very end, it says, and fire came forth from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar, and all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. So what Ibn Ezra is saying here is that there wasn't supposed to be any other fire that day that wasn't God's fire. They needed to just go with God's movement here and not start lighting their own fire. Okay, this makes sense in the sense that at least we have a sense, what is a strange fire? It's a fire that they lit, and that was not appropriate for that day. It was only supposed to be lit, a fire coming directly from God. Now, there's another commentary that I want to share with you. This is somebody whose name is Naftali Tzvi Berlin. He was a rabbi in the 19th century, so we're coming much closer to modern times. And he said something very interesting. He said, this is not literally the fire. It's not like they lit a fire, but he sees it in a more general way. And he says it is the fire of enthusiasm from the overwhelming love of God. Okay, so he says this fire is not really a literal fire, but some kind of fire in your spirit. Fire, you're on fire for something. It's that kind of a fire. And basically what he's saying, you know what? When you get involved in worship, when you get involved in a position where you are so close to God, it is easy to get swept away by your enthusiasm. You can enter a situation of ecstasy that loses control. And what he says here is, while overwhelming love of God is a very good thing, when it loses control, when it goes beyond the boundaries, it is dangerous. And I think we can all appreciate this idea. And I connect this, by the way, with this idea that Rashi brought, that they were drunk. Okay, I don't know if they were drunk on wine or whiskey or whatever, or they were drunk on the love of God. But both of them are saying very similar things. There was a loss of control. Now, very often when we think about spiritual experiences, this idea of a loss of control is almost built in. We want to lose ourselves in this experience. And what God is basically saying here is, no. You can be passionate. You can be very involved in the emotions and the spiritual experience, but you cannot lose yourself, because God is setting up a temple that has very strict guidelines. There are places that are so holy, that bring you in such close contact with God's presence. You must be careful. It is dangerous. And we talked about this when we were discussing some of the scriptures involving the building of the tabernacle at the end of the book of Exodus, how there are so many things set up there that has the combination of coming close to God and yet keeping a distance, because it is so holy. We talked about that with Revelation on Mount Sinai. There's that balance between standing there and hearing God's voice directly and yet keeping the distance from the mountain. Only Moses can go up to the top of the mountain. Everybody else has to keep their distance. And what this approach is basically saying, that the problem with the Nadav and Avihu was not that they were bad people, or that they were trying to do something evil or whatever, but they were too careless. They lost themselves in their ecstasy, and this was dangerous, this was bad, and this is something that could not be tolerated. Now, there's a very interesting midrash. Midrash, as I had mentioned before, is one of the earliest forms of commentary. It dates, the earliest traditions date back to the Second Temple period. Most of them were only written down afterwards, but they are a very old version of commentary, and it's a different type of commentary. Very often, the commentary comes in the form of stories that kind of fills in the gaps in the story that we have in the scriptures themselves. Now, and I've mentioned in the past, and I want to reiterate this, there's no way I do not treat these stories with the same reverence as I treat what we have in scripture. They are not necessarily God-given. They may be true. They may reflect oral traditions that were passed down through the generations. But the importance of these stories is the messages they give us, because through the stories, this was a well-known vehicle of teaching in ancient times. Through the story, the teacher was able to convey an important message. In this case, there's not so much a story as a connection between two different incidents. Now, I will I know there was one of you, I don't remember exactly who it was, but back some weeks ago, when we were discussing Exodus 24, this was in the Torah portion of Mishpatim, and it was part of our discussion of covenant. And we talked about the covenant that followed the giving of the 10 Commandments. And there was this whole scene in chapter 24 where there's an altar and different things going on and spilling the blood and writing down the words of the covenant. And then there's a very few little verses there that were very difficult. And somebody asked me about them and I said, we're going to take that up later. Well, this is when we're taking them up. Okay, so this is chapter 24, verse 11. Well, first of all, it starts with verse 9. We have here Moses, Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 elders. Okay, they're all going up towards the mountain. Okay, and then we have this very odd verse that says they basically saw something of the presence of the God of Israel. Okay, the verse says, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet, there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Okay, we don't understand what that was. They clearly had some kind of vision that represented the presence of God. Okay, verse 11. Yet he did not raise his hand. Now we're talking about God. He did not raise his hand against the noble, or the Hebrew word here is atzile. We don't know exactly what atzile is. I'm going to say for now, the noble people of the children of Israel. They saw God and they ate and drank. Okay. Now there is a very interesting midrash that connects this story and this verse with our story. We have Nadav and Avihu are mentioned here, and they saw. Who was they? It seems Moses, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and the 70 elders, or at least some of them. Some of the commentaries saying it was just Moses, Aaron, and Nadav and Avihu who saw this likeness. But who are the Atzile? Who are these noble of the children of Israel? It's an interesting thing. The word itself, Atzil, is used later on in Numbers 11. Numbers 11, verse 25, you can look at it or not, whatever. Let me just tell you what it's about. It's in the desert, and Moses is getting very frustrated, and he feels like he needs help. He needs help in sharing the burden of the leadership of Israel. And he doesn't just need help in like administrative help, he needs help in prophecy. And there's a very interesting story there where he gathers 70 leaders, and he kind of devolves or endows some of his prophecy or some of his prophetic spirit on these 70 people. The word that is used in Hebrew to say this endowment or transferring of the spirit is the same root, atzil. Okay, so it's possible that here when it talks about these sons of Israel who are atzilim, it could be that they are noble people, because that's one use of the word, but it could also be in that sense those who also shared some kind of prophetic capability or prophetic spirit. Okay, in any case, what this midrash comes to say, that these two people, Nadav and Avihu, they were the ones who saw God's presence and then ate and drank. And this was a very disrespectful, inappropriate thing to be doing at a point of such amazing spiritual revelation. And God refrained at that point, because it says, and he did not raise his hand against them. God refrained from punishing them, from killing him at this point. And this, then the Midrash goes on to say, but here in our story, they were punished. In other words, this, there were two problems with Nadav and Avihu. They did something wrong there, and they did something wrong again here. God refrained from punishing them there. That was in the middle of Mount Sinai. It was an amazing time. God did not want to mar the celebration, the amazing experience. But here it was already a second time, and here God did strike them down. I would put all of this together with this approach. We talked about that they're drunk or that they have over enthusiasm, knowing no boundaries. And I think all of these are talking about the same thing. And it's very similar to these Nadav and Avihu in the previous story in Exodus, that they have this vision of God and then they sit and eat and drink. Not appropriate, not understanding the limitations. You don't go into some Exodus, you picture these, nature parties or these parties that people have, and they go off into the woods and they get high and they just do whatever they want. They drink, they eat, they have sex. I mean, who knows what, okay? It's almost orgy-like behavior. Now, there's no indication here that Nadav and Avihu were going into orgy-like behavior, but you can understand how we're getting very close. Because if you get too involved in some ecstasy, okay, you're gonna cross the line. And so what God is seeing in both of these behaviors is two people who do not know how to restrain themselves and keep within the limitations. It becomes a very dangerous and very unhealthy approach to spirituality. And I think, by the way, that this is a message that resonates with all of us. I think we all know people people that are more or less spiritual, people are more involved in spiritual experiences, but I think we can all appreciate there's a point at which a spiritual experience can become over the top, can become dangerous, loses its grounding, loses its anchor. And I think this is one at least of the approaches or the messages that we can get from this chapter, from this story. I'd like to now go on to the very end of the story and what Moses says to Aaron. Picture this, Moses and Aaron are standing together. They see right then in front of their eyes, God strikes down two of Aaron's sons. The tragedy, the horror, the shock, it is amazing. And what does Moses say to Aaron? He says, this is what the Lord meant when he said, those nearest me, through those nearest me, I will sanctify myself and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. What is this talking about? If Nadav and Avihu did something wrong and were therefore punished, what is this about being holy? What is the sanctification that's going on here? Why it makes it sound almost as, from the way it's saying, is that it's, the people holiest, the people closest to me, those are the ones I'm going to sacrifice. I mean, what is this about? Okay, so first of all, there is a very standard way of approaching this, is that those closest to God, or those serving God in the most intimate way, are in the place where they have the ability to sanctify God's name. But they have to take that responsibility very, very seriously. Have this situation, all the nation is gathered around to see this fire coming out from God and consuming what's on the altar. And that is a moment of incredible opportunity to sanctify God's name. And if at that point, those who are closest, not meaning the most righteous, but those who are physically closest, those who are there, the priests, those who are there and about to take care of it, if they go wrong, okay, then this creates an enormous opportunity for desecration of God's name. And so basically what God is saying, that according to this interpretation, that those closest to me have to be most careful, because they hold in their hands the key to whether they will cause sanctification of God's name or desecration of God's name. And part of that, therefore, is also the understanding of the second part of that verse, and gain glory for all the people. They are the ones who are in that position to gain glory for God in front of everyone, all the people. So they have to be very, very careful. Now, the word glory here, the word is in Hebrew, ikaved. The word, in the sense of glory, is the word, Hebrew word is kavod. This particular verb, though, can be understood either as deriving from the word kavod, which means glory or honor, or it can come from the word kaved, which means heavy, okay? And there is another interpretation that says that when God, that has a totally different way of seeing this, that basically what Moses is saying is that when God judges the people closest to him, when God has to punish those who are most righteous, he does this with a very heavy heart. It weighs heavily on him before all the nation. Or you can say weighs more heavily on him than it does when he is punishing anyone else in the nation. Okay, two different ways of seeing the same thing. That's also a very nice way of looking at it. But in connection with that, this idea of what is Moses actually trying to say to Aaron, the second interpretation is much more words of comfort. What Moses is saying to Aaron is not that, you see, your sons really did something bad, and that's what happens when people that close do something bad. Instead, it interprets what Moses is saying is a terrific comfort to Aaron. And there's actually a midrash that takes us even further. And he says, I knew that on this day, one of us would be sacrificed. Someone would be sacrificed on this day. He says he knew this. He had a prophecy, or he knew this, but he didn't know who it would be. And he thought it would be himself. And when he saw it was Aaron's sons, he realized they must be holier than all of them. Now that is an amazing words of comfort that Moses would have given to Aaron. But I'm not, and you can read it as just Moses saying this to make Aaron feel better. It doesn't make a lot of sense because it's clear that they did something wrong. But on the other hand, it resonates with us very, very deeply. What is Aaron's answer? He's silent. He accepts. There's something in this conversation here between Moses and Aaron that resonates to us way beyond the actual story that's going on here in Leviticus 10. And in fact, I wonder when the Midrash was writing this, if they weren't actually commenting more on situations that they knew more than on what was really going on here with Nadav and Avihu. And I think there's nothing like Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we are commemorating today, that we can really and truly relate to this situation. Forget what Nadav and Avihu did. Take the story out of that context and see a story of two brothers standing together when the two sons of one of the brothers are killed before their very eyes for seemingly no reason, or for a reason they can't possibly understand. And one brother saying to the other brother, God takes those who are closest to him. God sacrifices those that are closest to him, that are holiest to him. And it's something we cannot understand, but it gives such hope. It gives such encouragement to us. And how many people during the Holocaust, seeing their babies, seeing their children murdered before their very eyes, knowing full well those children were pure. They were innocent. They didn't even have enough opportunity to sin. There was no reason for it. How could they have been murdered? And the only possible comfort that anybody can gain is that God wanted them closer to him. He wanted them there. And then you're silent. Because how can you argue with that? Because you do not understand God's will, and you do not understand. And when we look at the Holocaust and the people who were there, and even us today, we cannot possibly understand what happened. How was it that God allowed 6 million people, men, women, children, babies, to be murdered, and so many millions of others to suffer so terribly, and to suffer the murders of their children, and to suffer the murders of their families, and to suffer from torture? And when we look at this, we have no answer. And the only thing we can do is what Aaron did. We remain silent. But we remain silent within this context of holiness and sacrifice. And we do not understand how this is, but we know that somehow this is what it is about. And that's what I have to say today. Is a difficult story, but I think it resonates with all of us. There is something that we will never understand, but we have to just accept it. If anyone has a comment, we certainly can entertain that now. Thank you, Richard. Okay. Have a good weekend.
How could you comment after that?
Exactly. It's silent. We have to be silent. Have a good weekend. Remember the 6 million. They were every single person was somebody loved.
Shabbat shalom.
And we'll see you next week. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Sondra. Thank you very much for your
You're
time.
welcome.
I'll call the center. Look what I got.
I see. Wow.
Everybody
you.
should have one.
Yes, very good.
Actually, I keep meaning to suggest to people that they get it, and I forget.
Very good.
Very good.
Very good. Thank
What
you.
is it?
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
What's the book?
This is a book that I wrote. Actually,
Oh.
I'll get a copy of it and I'll show you one thing. Okay, it's this book, and this is a book that I wrote a few years ago, and it has the weekly Torah portions. Each one I write a comment about, a teaching, but it also has full color pictures that are scenes from Judea and Samaria, from biblical Israel. Each photograph is somehow connected to the message of the Torah portion.
How wonderful.
Yeah, so we sell it on our website, CFOIC.com. If you go to the website, I think there's a place where it says products or videos or books or something, and then you can easily order it that way. But if you have trouble doing that, you can always send me an email and I will send you the link how to do it.
All right, thank you.
Membership what, please?
What is the name of the book, Sondra?
The name of the book is Shabbat Shalom, which is the greeting that we say to one another, means Sabbath peace.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.